Rome 63 years before the birth of Christ. A hallway in a house on the Esquiline Hill. The oil lamps have burned low. The air smells of crushed flowers, spilled wine, and too many bodies pressed together in a space meant for half their number. More than 20 people are standing outside a closed door. They are singing, they are shouting. Some of them are clapping in rhythm. One man, an uncle by marriage who started drinking at noon, is pounding on the wood with a open palm and yelling suggestions that would get him arrested in any modern country on earth. Behind that door, a girl of 14 sits on a bed decorated with garlands, woolen bands, and small clay amulets, shaped like parts of the human body that polite company does not discuss. Beside her sits a young man of 22, whom she has met fewer than 5 times in her life. He is staring at the far wall with the expression of someone who has just realized that confidence and competence are not the same thing. She is staring at her hands. Neither of them speaks. Outside, the crowd gets louder. No one in this hallway thinks any of this is strange. No one thinks it is cruel. No one thinks it is an invasion of privacy, because privacy in ancient Rome is not a value. It is a vulnerability. And tonight, every single person here, from the trembling bride inside the room to the drunk uncle hammering on the door, is performing a specific function inside the most carefully engineered system that Rome ever built. Not the roads, not the aqueducts, not the legions. The wedding night. Because in ancient Rome, the wedding night was not a private moment between two people discovering each other for the first time. It was a machine, a legal machine, a social machine, a machine designed to produce one thing and one thing only: evidence. Evidence so public, so loud, so impossible to deny that no lawyer, no rival family, no scheming politician could ever stand up in a Roman court and say the words that Romans feared more than invasion, more than plague, more than the wrath of Jupiter himself. The words, "well, actually, this marriage was never properly completed." That sentence could destroy families. It could reverse property transfers worth fortunes. It could delegitimize children, collapse political alliances, and turn two of the most powerful households in Rome into blood enemies overnight. The wedding night existed to make that sentence impossible. And every single bizarre, uncomfortable, deeply weird ritual you are about to hear served that purpose with surgical precision. Here is the part that will stay with you long after this story ends. You are still performing pieces of this machine. The ring on your left hand, the bride carried over the threshold, the rice thrown at the church door, the cake cut together. The cake cut. You have been inside the Roman wedding machine your entire life. You just never knew who built it or why. To understand why more than 20 people are standing outside that door, you need to know what happened in the 6 hours before this moment. And to understand those 6 hours, you need to understand the two families who spent 3 months negotiating the contract that led to them. The bride's name was Claudia Tertia, 14 years old, third daughter of Lucius Claudius Pulcher, a senator of middling rank with ambitions that far exceeded his treasury. The Claudii were patrician old blood, the kind of family whose ancestors had held consulships when Rome was still a collection of mud huts arguing about drainage. But 3 generations of senators spending more than they earned had thinned the fortune considerably. Lucius needed money. Specifically, Lucius needed someone to finance his upcoming campaign for Adel, a magistracy that required not just votes, but spectacular public games, and spectacular public games required cash that Lucius did not have. The groom's name was Marcus Caelius Rufus, 22 years old, son of a wealthy equestrian family from Inner Amna, a prosperous town south of Rome known for producing excellent olive oil and absolutely no political influence whatsoever. The Caeli had money. They had commercial connections across Campania. What they did not have was a patrician name. In Rome, money opened doors, but only a name like Claudius kept them open. Marcus's father wanted his grandchildren to carry patrician blood. Lucius wanted Marcus's father's money. Claudia was not consulted. This was not an oversight. This was the system functioning exactly as designed. In Rome, engagement was more dangerous than marriage. The sponsalia, the formal betrothal, was not a romantic promise exchanged over dinner. It was a binding legal agreement with financial consequences that could follow a family for generations. Lucius had committed a dosa dowry package that included a cash sum equivalent to several years of a skilled tradesman's income plus a small villa in Campania that had been in the family for 2 generations. If the marriage failed because of something Claudia's family did, if she was found to have been unchaste, if Lucius tried to withdraw after signing the entire dowry had to be returned plus penalties. If the marriage failed because of Marcus, because he was impotent, because he refused to consummate, because he turned out to already be married, Claudia's family kept everything and could demand additional compensation. This was not romance. This was financial engineering. And like all financial engineering, it required ironclad documentation. The problem was that Rome in 63 BC had no marriage registry. No government office stamped your certificate and filed it in triplicate. No database recorded your union for future reference. Legal proof of marriage came from one source only: witnesses, human beings who could stand in a courtroom years later and swear under oath that they had seen the marriage happen with their own eyes. And this is why the Roman wedding night was loud, public, uncomfortable, and absolutely impossible to ignore. Every ritual you are about to hear was designed to create witnesses, hundreds of them. Witnesses who saw witnesses, who heard witnesses, who could never credibly claim they did not know this marriage had taken place. The engagement ring tells you how deep this system ran. The annulus pronubis, the Roman betrothal ring, was placed on the fourth finger of the left hand. Not randomly. Romans believed a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. They called it the vena amoris, the vein of love. The anatomy was wrong. The tradition survived anyway. It survived the fall of Rome. It survived the Middle Ages. It survived the Renaissance. It survived the Atlantic crossing. And it survived long enough that right now, today, if you are wearing a wedding ring on your left hand, you are practicing a Roman ritual that is over 2,000 years old. You just never thought to ask why that particular finger. Now you know, a Roman anatomist guessed wrong, and the entire Western world followed his mistake for 20 centuries. That is how powerful Roman tradition was. Even when it was based on nothing, it outlasted empires. On the morning of her wedding day, Claudia was prepared by her mother and the women of her household beginning at dawn. Her hair was divided into 6 sections using a curved iron spearhead called the hasta calibaris, the same type of weapon used in combat. No one alive in Claudia's time knew exactly why a weapon was used to style a bride's hair. The tradition was so old that even Roman scholars could only shrug and say, "Our ancestors did it this way." Some guessed it connected the bride to the warrior spirit of early Rome. Others thought it warded off evil spirits. The truth had been lost centuries before Claudia was born. But the tradition continued because in Rome, not understanding a ritual was never a sufficient reason to stop performing it. You did it because your grandmother did it. Your grandmother did it because her grandmother did it. And somewhere in that unbroken chain was a reason that no longer needed to exist because the habit had replaced it entirely. Claudia's wedding dress was not white. White in ancient Rome was associated with mourning and the garments of the dead. Claudia wore the flammeum, a large veil of deep orange, the color of flame, the color of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. The color said continuity. It said the sacred fire of the household would burn uninterrupted from one generation to the next. The tradition of wearing white to weddings did not begin until Queen Victoria of England chose a white gown in 1840, more than 1,800 years after Claudia stood in her orange veil and let her mother adjust the folds for the last time. Her mother told her to cry. Not because she was sad, though she may have been. Not because the moment was overwhelming, though it certainly was. Her mother told her to cry because in Roman society, a bride who walked to her wedding with dry eyes and a smile was suspicious. Eagerness suggested desire. Desire suggested experience. Experience suggested impudicitia, a lack of sexual virtue that could in the worst case be used as legal grounds to challenge the marriage itself. Claudia's tears were not emotion, they were armor. Every tear that ran down her face in front of witnesses was another layer of protection against anyone who might later whisper that she had been too willing, too eager, too ready to leave her father's house. In the Roman legal system, a woman's reputation was not a personal matter. It was a financial instrument. Damage it, and you damaged every contract attached to it. So Claudia cried. Her mother watched with the clinical satisfaction of a woman who had rehearsed this moment with her daughter 3 times in the past week. The tears looked convincing. Good. They needed to be. The wedding ceremony itself took place at Claudia's family home in the late afternoon. A priest examined the entrails of a sheep, specifically the liver, looking for signs of divine approval or disapproval. This was not symbolic. An auspex, a trained religious official, actually cut open an animal, pulled out its organs, and studied their shape, color, and texture to determine whether the gods approved of this particular marriage on this particular day. If the liver looked wrong, if there were unusual spots, discolorations, or deformities, the wedding could be postponed entirely. Families that had spent months negotiating, that had committed fortunes in dowry, that had invited hundreds of guests could watch the entire event collapse because a sheep's liver had an unusual lobe. On this day, the liver was acceptable. The auspex nodded. The ceremony continued. Claudia and Marcus joined hands in the traditional gesture of dextrarum iunctio, right hand clasping right hand, while the pronuba, a married woman of good standing, whose husband was still alive, guided their hands together. The pronuba's qualifications mattered enormously. She had to have been married exactly once to a man who was still living. A woman who had been widowed or divorced could not serve. Her unbroken marriage was the credential. She was living proof that the system worked, and her touch was meant to transfer that success to the new couple. Words were spoken, contracts were witnessed. The bride said the traditional phrase, ubi tu Gaius ego Gaia. Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia. The names were formulaic, not personal. Every bride said Gaius. Every bride said Gaia. The words connected Claudia not to Marcus specifically, but to every Roman marriage that had ever existed. She was not just joining a household. She was joining a tradition. Then came the Cena Nuptialis, the wedding banquet held at the bride's family home. Food was served. Wine was poured generously. Guests ate, drank, and enjoyed themselves with the knowledge that the truly uncomfortable portion of the evening had not yet begun. Because everything so far, the ceremony, the prayers, the handshake, the feast, and all of it was merely the introduction. The real wedding night started when the sun went down and the torches were lit. As darkness fell, the moment arrived that every guest had been anticipating with a mixture of excitement and theatrical enthusiasm. Claudia was to be taken from her mother's arms and escorted to her new husband's home. But the word escorted does not capture what actually happened. Claudia was seized, pulled, physically removed from her mother's embrace by the three pronubi, while her mother held on and Claudia resisted with the desperate energy of a girl being torn from everything she had ever known. This was choreographed. Every person in the room knew it was choreographed. Claudia's mother knew she would let go. Claudia knew she would be taken. The pronubi knew exactly how firmly to pull. And yet the performance was mandatory because what it symbolized was the most important legal transition of the entire night. Claudia was leaving her father's patria potestas, the absolute legal authority that a Roman father held over his children, and entering the manus of her husband, his legal power over her. This was not a metaphor. This was a change in legal status as real and binding as a change in citizenship. From this moment forward, Claudia no longer belonged to the household of Lucius Claudius Pulcher. She belonged to the household of Marcus Caelius Rufus, his gods, his ancestors, his obligations. The pulling was specific. Right hand first, toward the left side. Details that seem meaningless until you understand that in Rome, a political enemy who wanted to challenge this marriage could argue in court that the ritual was performed incorrectly. In the recorded speeches of Cicero, there is a legal dispute in which an opposing family challenged the validity of a marriage, partly on the grounds that proper ritual sequence had not been followed. The case involved property worth enough to fund a small army. It dragged on for months. Assets were frozen. Reputations were destroyed. All because someone argued that a bride had walked when she should have been pulled. These were not meaningless traditions. These were traditions that lawyers made their living from. Every detail mattered because every detail could be weaponized later by someone with enough money and enough grudge to try to say. Once Claudia was pulled from her mother, the deductio began. The torch-lit procession through the streets of Rome. This was not a quiet walk. This was not a gentle stroll through the evening air. This was a roaring, singing, fire-carrying parade designed to ensure that every single person within a quarter-mile of the route knew that a marriage had just occurred. The procession was led by a young boy carrying a special torch made from the wood of the spina, alba, the white hawthorn tree. This boy was not chosen randomly. He had to be a Camillus, a child whose father and mother were both still alive. The Latin term was patrimus et matrimus, literally one who still has a father and mother. This requirement existed because the boy was a living symbol. His parents' intact marriage proved that the system worked. He was walking evidence that marriage produced stability, continuity, and children who survived to carry torches of their own. His presence blessed the procession by example. The torch itself mattered. Hawthorn wood was believed to have protective properties against malicious spirits. But the fire served a practical purpose that was arguably more important than any supernatural one. It was nighttime. The streets of Rome were dark, and a procession of fire moving through those streets was visible to everyone. Every person who saw the torches from a window, every shopkeeper who stepped outside to watch, every neighbor who paused in their doorway, all of them became witnesses. They saw the bride. They saw the groom. They saw the procession moving from one house to another. In a world without marriage certificates, without government databases, without paper records of any kind, this torch-lit march through the streets was the registration system. It recorded the marriage not in ink, but in fire, not on paper, but in the memory of every person who watched it pass. And then came the singing, the Fescennine verses. And this is where modern sensibilities collide with Roman practicality in the most spectacular way possible. As the procession moved through the streets, guests sang. They sang loudly. They sang with enthusiasm. And they sang things so explicitly, so creatively, so comprehensively obscene that Roman historians writing centuries later declined to record the specific content, noting only that the songs were traditional and extremely vulgar. When Roman historians, people who wrote casually about gladiatorial death and political assassination, refused to repeat something because it was too crude, you can begin to appreciate the level of content we are discussing. The poet Catullus, in his 61st poem, preserves one of the few written records of what these wedding songs actually contained. Even in the relatively restrained version that survived in literary form, the content is graphic enough to make clear that Roman wedding guests did not hold back. They mocked the groom's sexual abilities. They made explicit predictions about what would happen behind closed doors. They shouted anatomical references that would get them permanently removed from any modern wedding reception within the first 30 seconds. But this was not rudeness. This was not drunken misbehavior tolerated because everyone was in a festive mood. This was a legal function disguised as entertainment. The Fescennine verses publicly established in front of hundreds of witnesses that the purpose of this marriage was sexual consummation and the production of children. This mattered enormously. If anyone ever at any point in the future tried to claim that this was merely a financial arrangement, that it was a business partnership, that consummation was never intended, there would be 200 people who could testify that the entire neighborhood had spent an hour singing in graphic detail about exactly what was supposed to happen next. The songs were evidence, loud, vulgar, unforgettable evidence. And every Roman in that procession understood that their singing was not just tradition. It was testimony they might be called to give someday. The groom walked near the bride during the procession, maintaining what we might call dignified proximity. His expression, according to custom, was supposed to convey seriousness and readiness. The expression of a man who understood the weight of what was about to happen. In practice, this probably looked more like the expression of a 22-year-old trying very hard not to react to 200 people publicly discussing his anatomy at full volume. The bride walked with her eyes down, modest, restrained, absorbing the chaos around her without responding to it. This was not just tradition. This was strategic. By remaining silent and composed while the crowd shouted obscenities, Claudia demonstrated the quality that Roman society valued above almost all others in a woman: pudicitia, sexual modesty, restraint under pressure, the ability to endure scrutiny without losing dignity. Every moment she kept her composure was another moment that proved she was exactly the kind of woman a patrician family should welcome into their household. The procession finally arrived at the house of Marcus Caelius Rufus on the Esquiline Hill. The torches threw orange light across the stone doorway. The singing reached a peak, and then, not suddenly but gradually, like a wave pulling back from the shore, the crowd quieted. Because they understood that what came next was not entertainment, it was sacred. Claudia stopped at the threshold. She reached into a small pouch carried by one of the pronubii and took out two substances: wolf fat and olive oil. She smeared them on the doorpost one side and then the other, her fingers leaving glistening streaks on the stone. The wolf fat connected her to the founding myth of Rome itself, to Romulus and Remus, to the she-wolf who nursed them. By touching wolf fat to her new home's entrance, Claudia was claiming Roman identity at the most primal level. She was saying in the language of ritual that every person present understood, I am Roman. This is my city. These are my myths. I belong here. Then she tied strips of white wool to the doorframe. Wool was the symbol of the Roman matron's primary duty, the management of the household. The wool declared her new role: domina, mistress of this house, manager of its slaves, guardian of its storerooms, keeper of its accounts. She was not entering as a prisoner. She was entering as an executive, assuming command of operations that she would control for the rest of her life. And then she stopped. She did not step inside. She could not. Because in the Roman mind, the threshold was not a piece of architecture. It was a boundary between worlds. Every Roman house was protected by its own gods. The Lares, guardian spirits of the family, watched over the household from a small shrine near the hearth. The Penates, protectors of the food stores, ensured prosperity. These were not abstract theological concepts that Romans discussed in philosophical terms and then ignored in practice. These were real presences. Romans prayed to them daily. They left offerings of food and wine. They consulted them before major decisions. The household gods were as real to a Roman family as the walls and the roof. The threshold was where the outside world ended and the gods' territory began. Crossing it meant entering their domain. And entering the domain of gods you had not been properly introduced to was dangerous. A stumble at the threshold was catastrophic. It meant the gods rejected you. It meant misfortune was coming. It meant this marriage would be haunted by bad luck from its very first moment. And in a society where neighbors remembered everything and forgot nothing, a bride who stumbled at the threshold would hear about it for the rest of her life. 10 years later, when the harvest was bad, someone would mutter about the threshold. 20 years later, when a child fell ill, someone would remember. The stumble would become the explanation for everything that ever went wrong, because Romans believed in causation through ritual failure, the way modern insurance companies believe in actuarial tables. The math was different, but the logic was the same. One wrong move could cost you everything. So Marcus lifted Claudia off her feet and carried her over the threshold. This was not romantic. This was not tender. This was engineering. If the bride never touched the threshold, she could not stumble on it. If she could not stumble, she could not offend the gods. Problem solved with the elegant practicality that Romans applied to everything from road construction to conquest. And here's the part that will change the way you think about your own wedding if you have ever had one. This tradition, carrying the bride over the threshold, did not die with Rome. It crossed the Mediterranean. It crossed the English Channel. It crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And it arrived in America, where it became one of the most common wedding night traditions in the country, practiced by millions of couples who have absolutely no idea that they are performing an ancient Roman ritual designed to avoid offending household gods whose names they have never heard. If you carried your wife over the threshold on your wedding night, you performed a Roman religious ceremony. You just did not know it. And the gods, if they were watching, probably appreciated the gesture regardless. Inside the house, Claudia was led to the Lararium, the family shrine near the hearth, for her formal introduction to the household gods of the Kylie. This was her moment of religious transfer. From this night forward, the gods of her father's house no longer protected her. She belonged to new gods now. She poured a small libation of wine, placed a piece of bread on the shrine, and left a single small coin. The offerings were modest. The meaning was not. She was asking these unfamiliar gods to accept her, to protect her, to count her as family. If they refused, if the omens in the coming weeks suggested divine displeasure, the consequences could range from mild anxiety to genuine crisis. Marcus stood beside her during this ritual, serious and still. As head of the household, he was responsible for maintaining good relations with the gods. A successful wedding night was evidence of divine approval. A troubled one raised questions that no one wanted to answer. Marcus needed the gods to cooperate. Claudia needed the gods to accept her. And neither of them had any way of knowing whether that had happened until weeks or months later, when the absence of disaster would serve as the closest thing to confirmation they would ever receive. But the gods were not the only audience that night. And the rituals at the shrine were only the middle act of a performance that was far from finished. Because outside the house, more than 20 guests were still very much present, and they had no intention of leaving. The lectus genialis, the marriage bed, was not located in a private bedroom. It was placed in the atrium, the central room of the Roman house, the most public space in the entire building. The atrium was where business was conducted, where clients waited each morning to greet the head of household, where the family's wealth and status were displayed for every visitor to see. Placing the marriage bed here was a declaration so obvious that no Roman could have missed it. This marriage is not private. It belongs to the household. It belongs to the family. It belongs to the ancestors watching from wherever Roman ancestors watched. The bed was decorated with flowers, woolen bands, and small protective amulets placed at the corners. Near the bed stood a small figure of Priapus, the god of fertility famous across the Roman world for his spectacularly exaggerated anatomy. Priapus was not subtle. Roman art depicting him was not subtle. The statue's presence near the marriage bed was a visual prayer for fertility, delivered with the kind of anatomical directness that Romans considered perfectly normal, and modern museum visitors find requires a moment of adjustment. The senior Pronuba, the most respected married woman in the wedding party, guided Claudia to the bed. The older women of Marcus's family were there too, adjusting the bride's clothing, arranging the covers, and offering advice. The advice, based on surviving references in Roman literature, was practical to a degree that makes modern wedding planning guides read like children's books. These women had done this before. They had been brides themselves. They had borne children. They had buried husbands. And they dispensed their accumulated wisdom with the calm authority of professionals who considered embarrassment an unnecessary emotion. Claudia was positioned on the bed, not thrown, not pushed. Positioned, carefully, deliberately, in accordance with tradition that dictated even this. She sat, she waited, and then attention turned to a very specific piece of clothing. The belt. The cingulum, a woolen band tied around the bride's waist in a knot that Roman tradition called the nodus Herculaneus, the knot of Hercules. It was not called that because it was difficult to untie, though it may have been. It was called that because Hercules, according to Roman mythology, had fathered 70 children. 70. The knot was a prayer compressed into rope, a plea for fertility condensed into a single loop of wool. By tying this knot with the name of the most prolific father in mythology, the Romans were doing what they always did. They were using symbolism the way other civilizations used incantations. Precisely, deliberately, and with total confidence that getting the details right would produce the desired result. Only the groom could untie this knot. No one helped him. No one guided his hands. No one offered hints. This was his moment, his first act as a husband, and it carried weight far beyond the physical task. Untying the knot symbolized his assumption of authority, his acceptance of responsibility, his willingness to continue the family line. If he fumbled, if his fingers shook visibly, if he took too long or too short or appeared confused, the women in the room would notice, and they would remember. And by morning, every woman in the extended family would know exactly how the untying had gone. Roman gossip networks operated with the speed and reliability of military communication systems. Information about a fumbled Hercules knot could cross the city in a day. Claudia sat perfectly still while Marcus worked at the knot. She did not help. She did not comment. She did not reach down to guide his fingers. Tradition required her to be passive in this moment, and passivity in this specific context was protection. If anything went wrong tonight, if there was any problem, any failure, any shortcoming, no one could blame Claudia. She had done everything the system asked. She had cried at the right moments. She had resisted being taken. She had crossed the threshold without stumbling. She had greeted the guns. She had sat on the bed without complaint. She was by every measure Roman society recognized above reproach. The knot came loose. Marcus set the belt aside. And now finally we return to where this story began. The door closed, or more precisely, the door was pushed shut from the inside while more than 20 people remained gathered in the hallway on the other side of it. They did not leave. They were not expected to leave. They were performing the last and most critical function of the entire wedding night machine. They began singing again. The Fescennine versus Night edition, louder and more pointed than the street versions, directed specifically at Marcus, with suggestions, encouragements, and commentary that left nothing to the imagination. They knocked on the door. They shouted questions. They demanded signs that the marriage was proceeding on schedule. One particularly persistent uncle made a joke that even by Roman standards crossed a line and was cheered by the rest of the hallway for his commitment to tradition. This was not cruelty. This was not entertainment. This was the final layer of the evidence machine, and it worked like this. The torch-lit procession had proven the marriage was public. The Fescennine verses had established the sexual purpose. The threshold crossing had transferred the bride. The gods had been consulted. The knot had been untied. Every single piece of the legal puzzle was in place except one: consummation. And the crowd outside the door was there to witness it, not by seeing, by hearing, by being present, by establishing beyond any possible future doubt that they were there, that the couple was inside, that enough time had passed, and that no one had emerged to report a problem. Silence from inside the room was bad. Silence suggested hesitation. Hesitation suggested inability. Inability suggested that the marriage might not have been completed, and an incomplete marriage in Roman law could be annulled. The dowry would be returned. The contract would collapse. Two families would become enemies. And everything that had been negotiated over 3 careful months would burn. So the crowd stayed. They made noise. They ensured that noise existed on both sides of the door. The Roman wedding night machine could not tolerate silence, because silence created the one thing the entire system was designed to prevent: doubt. Inside the room, Marcus and Claudia faced the moment that the machine could not control. Two human beings, young, nervous, pressured from every direction, surrounded by expectations so total that the air itself seemed to vibrate with it. The system had designed every step of their journey to this point. It had choreographed the tears, scripted the resistance, engineered the procession, stage-managed the singing, and supervised the bed. But it had not, could not, would not teach these two people how to be with each other. Roman society assumed competence in the groom by default. Marcus was a man. That was considered qualification enough. Whether he was prepared, informed, experienced, or emotionally ready was not a question anyone thought to ask. The answer was assumed. Reality was expected to conform to the assumption, and when it did not, tradition had no backup plan. Claudia was expected to be passive, modest, silent. She did not lead. She did not instruct. She did not express fear or relief or anything at all, because a respectable Roman bride absorbed this moment the way she had absorbed every other moment of the night, quietly, without complaint, with the understanding that duty did not require enthusiasm, only completion. The expectations were contradictory in a way that Roman society never acknowledged. The groom was supposed to be confident without experience. The bride was supposed to be cooperative without agency. Both were supposed to perform a deeply personal act while relatives shouted encouragement from 8 feet away. And both were supposed to emerge the next morning as if this was the most natural sequence of events imaginable. The noise outside the door eventually faded, not because the guests decided to respect the couple's privacy. There was no such concept in operation here. The noise faded because the guests believed they had done their job. The spirits had been driven away. The marriage had been witnessed at every stage. The evidence was complete. The machine had run its full cycle. The crowd dispersed into the night with the satisfied exhaustion of people who had performed their civic duty and could now go home and sleep, knowing that the social order was intact. Inside the room, two people lay in the dark, listening to the last footsteps echo down the hallway. Whether they spoke to each other is not recorded. Whether they found comfort in each other's company is not mentioned in any source. Roman writers did not consider that detail important enough to preserve. The machine had no use for emotions that could not be witnessed. Morning came the way morning comes to every new marriage, without permission and too soon. But in ancient Rome, the morning after the wedding night was not a quiet private affair, where two people slowly adjusted to their new reality over breakfast and careful conversation. The morning was the final act, the inspection, the verification, the last gear turning in the machine. The women arrived early. Marcus's mother led them, Aunt's older cousins, women of the household who had seen dozens of wedding nights and approached this one with the brisk efficiency of experienced professionals, conducting a routine audit. They did not knock. Knocking implied that the people inside had the option of declining the visit. They did not. The purpose of this visit is the part of the Roman wedding night that modern audiences find most disturbing. The older women were there to confirm that the marriage had been consummated. They examined the evidence. They formed their conclusions. And their conclusions became, in effect, a legal certification. These women were functioning as notaries public in an age before notaries existed. Their testimony, if ever needed in a court of law, would confirm that the marriage was complete, that the contract was fulfilled, that the dowry was earned, and that any children born from this point forward were legitimate heirs to both families' names and fortunes. But here is the part that changes everything you have heard tonight. Here is the twist that turns this entire story on its head. The inspection did not only protect Marcus's family, it protected Claudia. Every step of the wedding night that sounded like it was designed to control the bride was also designed to protect her. The system worked in both directions, and the morning inspection was where that dual purpose became most visible. Consider what happens if Marcus did not consummate the marriage. If he was impotent, if he was too drunk from the wedding feast, if he simply refused. Without the morning inspection, Claudia would have no proof. Her word against his, her family's claim against his family's denial. A legal nightmare that could drag on for years, while Claudia's youth, her reputation, and her future withered in courtrooms. But with the inspection, the women of Marcus's own family became witnesses for Claudia. If Marcus failed, they could not deny it. They had been there. They had seen. Their own testimony would confirm that the bride had fulfilled every obligation while the groom had not. Claudia's family could then annul the marriage, recover the full dowry demand, additional compensation for the insult, and begin arranging a new match for their daughter, whose reputation would remain intact because the system had documented her innocence at every step. The crowd outside the doors served the same function. They were witnesses that Marcus had the opportunity. The Fescennine verses confirmed that everyone understood what was expected. The nod of Hercules proved Marcus had begun the process. If he failed to complete it, the entire chain of evidence pointed in one direction. It was not her fault. The Roman wedding night machine was not designed to oppress the bride. It was designed to ensure that neither side could cheat, neither side could lie, neither side could rewrite history later when inheritance was at stake and memories conveniently faded. The system was brutal in its transparency, but transparency in a world without documentation was the only protection anyone had. This is the hidden logic behind every uncomfortable moment of this story. The tears were legal armor for the bride. The crowd was a witness pool for both families. The songs were testimony against future denial. The inspection was insurance that worked in both directions. The machine looked cruel from the outside. From the inside, it was the most equitable system available in a world where a woman's rights depended entirely on other people's willingness to tell the truth about what they had seen. After the inspection, Claudia shared her first morning meal with her new family. She sat at a specific position at the table to the right of Marcus, lower than his father, in a place that communicated her rank within the household hierarchy. This position would not change. Not next week, not next year, not for the rest of her married life. The seat was not just a seat. It was a statement. And like everything else in Rome, it had legal implications. Claudia began her household duties immediately. This was not punishment, it was assumption of power. The Roman domina, the mistress of the house, controlled the household's finances, managed its slaves, supervised its food supply, and directed its daily operations. In modern terms, she was the chief operating officer of a small business that employed between 5 and 30 people depending on the family's wealth. She managed inventory, directed labor, controlled expenditure, and reported to no one except technically her husband, who in practice was usually too busy with politics, business, or war to interfere with domestic management. Claudia did not enter the house of Marcus Caelius Rufus as a captive. She entered as a new manager, taking control of operations that had been waiting for her arrival. Whether she wanted the rank was irrelevant. The job was hers regardless. And by the standards of the only system she had ever known, it was significant. It was respected. And it was hers to execute for the rest of her life. The Roman wedding night machine worked. It worked for the Republic. It worked for the Empire. It worked with minor modifications for over 700 years. And like all machines that work, it was only truly understood when it broke. Three women across three different centuries demonstrated exactly what happened when the machine's gears slipped. Their stories are not digressions from the wedding night. They are proof of why every single ritual existed in the first place. The first was Julia, daughter of Augustus, the most powerful woman in Rome by birth and eventually the most publicly disgraced. Augustus, the first emperor, was obsessed with marriage. He saw it as the foundation of Roman civilization, the mechanism that produced citizens, secured property, and maintained order. In 18 BC, he pushed through the Lex Julia de Adulterius, a law that made adultery a criminal offense, punishable by exile and confiscation of property. Marriage under Augustus was not just tradition, it was enforced by the state with the kind of enthusiasm that Romans usually reserved for military campaigns. The law was named after his family. The Julia in Lex Julia was his own bloodline. The irony of what happened next would be almost funny if the consequences had not been so devastating. His daughter Julia married strategically 3 times to men. Augustus chose for political purposes, began conducting affairs that were neither discreet nor apologetic. She was seen at public events with men who were not her husband. She attended parties that Roman gossip networks described in detail. The affairs became so well known that they functioned as open mockery of her father's legislation. The man who made adultery a crime could not control his own daughter. Augustus was eventually forced to act. He exiled Julia under the very law that bore her family name. He sent her to a barren island. He forbade wine and male visitors. He never spoke to her again. The creator of the machine was crushed by his own creation. Julia's story proves something that the wedding night rituals had always assumed. The system did not care who you were. Senator or slave emperor's daughter or merchant's wife, the machine ground forward regardless. That was its strength, and that was its cost. The second was Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, and her story proves something even more disturbing about the power of ritual. In the year 48 AD, while Claudius was away from Rome attending to business at the port of Ostia, Messalina did something that no Roman wife had ever done before. She held a wedding, a full formal witnessed wedding, complete with torch-lit procession, fescennine versus guests' offerings, and every single ritual element of a proper Roman marriage. The groom was Gaius Silius, a young senator she had taken as a lover. The wedding was performed with every traditional requirement satisfied. Witnesses were present, songs were sung, the threshold was crossed, the marriage bed was prepared. Every gear of the machine turned exactly as it was supposed to turn, and this created a legal crisis that nearly paralyzed the imperial administration. Because the machine did not measure intention, it measured procedure. If the rituals were correctly performed and witnesses could confirm it was this a valid marriage, had Messalina legally divorced Claudius simply by performing the correct ceremonies with another man? Could an empress accidentally unmarry an emperor by following tradition too precisely? The question terrified Claudius's advisors, not because the answer was clearly no, but because the answer was not clearly anything. The system had been designed so thoroughly, so completely, so focused on ritual compliance as the measure of legitimacy that a literal interpretation of the rules suggested Messalina might have a case. This was the nightmare scenario. The machine designed to eliminate doubt had created the greatest doubt in Roman legal history. Claudius resolved the crisis the Roman way. Messalina was executed, Silius was executed. The wedding was declared invalid by imperial decree rather than legal argument. But the question lingered longer than both of them. It proved that the Romans had built a system so powerful that even they were afraid of what happened when someone used it against them. The third was Agrippina, mother of Nero, and she proved the final point, that the Roman marriage machine was not just a family tool. At the highest levels, it was a weapon of state. Agrippina married her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius, in 49 AD, just 1 year after Messalina's execution. The Senate had to pass special legislation to make the marriage legal, since unions between uncle and niece were normally prohibited. Agrippina did not want Claudius. She wanted the throne for her son Nero from a previous marriage. And marriage was the delivery mechanism. Within 5 years, Claudius was dead, almost certainly poisoned, and Nero sat on the imperial throne at the age of 16. Agrippina had used the wedding machine, the same system designed to protect families and secure property, to engineer the transfer of supreme power over the known world. The machine did not distinguish between a merchant's daughter marrying for dowry security and an empress marrying for imperial succession. It processed both with the same rituals, the same witnesses, the same knots and thresholds and torches. The machine did not judge, it simply ran. What unites these three women is not scandal, it is what happened after. Each crisis did not destroy the wedding machine. Each crisis made it stronger. Augustus added new laws after Julia. Claudius tightened imperial control after Messalina. The system absorbed the shock, added new gears, and continued grinding forward. This is why the machine lasted 700 years. Not because it was perfect, but because it was adaptive. Every failure taught it something. Every scandal became a patch in the code. The wedding night rituals that Claudia experienced in 63 BC were simpler than the ones performed 200 years later, because 200 years of failures had added 200 years of safeguards. The machine did not run on perfection. It ran on correction. And correction in Rome was endless. Now the story comes to where it always had to end. Not in Rome, not in a torchlit street or a decorated atrium, but here, in the present, in the traditions that you carry without knowing their weight. The ring on the fourth finger of your left hand, vena amoris, the vein of love. Roman anatomy wrong for 2,000 years, still circling your finger every single day. The bride carried over the threshold. Not romance, Roman engineering. A solution to a supernatural problem that no one alive believes in anymore, performed so faithfully for so many generations that it became instinct. You do not think about why you do it. You just do it. Because your parents did it. Because their parents did it. Because somewhere in that chain, a Roman groom lifted a Roman bride over a Roman threshold to keep the household gods from noticing her feet. The rice thrown after the ceremony, or flower petals, or bird seed depending on the venue's rules. All of them variations on the Roman tradition of throwing nut seeds and dried fruits at the couple as they left the ceremony. A fertility blessing. A prayer for children. Delivered by projectile because Romans believed that abundance, like good luck, sometimes needed to be thrown at people to make it stick. The wedding cake cut together by bride and groom, a descendant of the confariatio, the most sacred and binding form of Roman marriage, in which the couple shared a cake made from spelt wheat in the presence of the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest in Rome. Sharing bread meant sharing life. Breaking it together meant entering a union that, in the case of confariatio, was nearly impossible to dissolve. The modern wedding cake is lighter, sweeter, and covered in frosting that would have confused a Roman pastry chef. But the act of cutting it together, blade guided by 4 hands, carries the same meaning it carried 2,000 years ago. We are in this together now. The father giving away the bride, walking her down the aisle, placing her hand in the groom's hand. This is the patria potestas transfer, dressed in a morning suit and set to organ music. The father is symbolically releasing his legal authority over his daughter and passing it to her husband. The act has been stripped of its legal power. Fathers no longer own their daughters in any Western legal system. But the gesture persists because gestures outlast the laws that created them. The form survives even when the function is gone. The best man standing at the groom's side. Originally in traditions influenced by Roman and Germanic customs, the best man was not a friend offering moral support. He was a guard. His job was to protect the bride from being seized by rivals or reclaimed by her family after the ceremony. He stood at the groom's right hand because that was the sword hand, and his presence was not ceremonial. It was military. The best man at a modern wedding gives a toast and holds the rings. The best man at a Roman-era wedding held a weapon and watched the crowd for trouble. The tuxedo is an improvement. The function is a ghost. You are inside the machine. You have always been inside the machine. Every wedding you have attended, every ceremony you have watched, every tradition you have followed, without questioning, carries a piece of Rome in its structure. The machine was so well built, so deeply embedded in the cultures that inherited it, that it continued running for 2,000 years after the civilization that created it collapsed. The roads crumbled, the aqueducts dried up, the legions disbanded, but the wedding machine kept turning, carried across continents by people who had forgotten where it came from, but could not stop performing its rituals because the rituals felt right in a way that no one could quite explain. Claudia Tertia lived the rest of her life in the house on the Esquiline Hill. No Roman source records whether she was happy. No poet wrote about her marriage. No historian mentioned whether she and Marcus eventually found affection, companionship, or even basic comfort in each other's company. These details were not considered important enough to preserve. The machine had no use for data it could not weigh, measure, or present in court. What is recorded is that the marriage held. The contract was fulfilled. The dowry remained with the groom's family. Children were presumably born, though their names, if they existed, did not survive the centuries. By every measure that Rome cared about, the wedding night of Claudia Tertia and Marcus Caelius Rufus was a success. The system worked. The rituals were followed. The witnesses did their job. The gods were satisfied. The morning inspection confirmed completion. The evidence was assembled, stored in the memories of every person who had been present, and ready to be recalled at any point in the future, should anyone be foolish enough to challenge the validity of this union. The machine ran its cycle. The gears turned. The output was produced, and two people, barely more than children, were left inside it to figure out the part that no machine has ever been able to engineer. How to share a life with someone you did not choose in a house that was not yours, surrounded by gods you just met under rules you did not write. The Roman wedding night was not weird. It was honest. It did not pretend marriage was about love. It did not disguise its function behind soft language or beautiful stories. It said plainly what modern weddings wrap in flowers and music and carefully written vows. This is a contract. These are the witnesses. This is the evidence. And once this night is over, there is no version of events in which it did not happen. 2,000 years later, you still wear the ring on the left hand. You still carry the bride. You still throw the rice. You still cut the cake. You still walk the aisle. You are still performing the rituals. You just forgot who taught them to you. The Romans built a machine for their wedding nights. They built it carefully, tested it against scandal, reinforced it after failure, and ran it for 7 centuries without interruption. Then their empire fell, and the machine should have stopped. It did not stop. It is still running, and you are still in the audit. You just never knew who built it or why. Now you do.